I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Russian Federation. We thank Mr. Voronkov and Mr. Weisheng Chen for their detailed analysis of the fight against ISIL-Daesh. We are grateful for the efforts of the UN Office for Counterterrorism and the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate to the Security Council in this important area. The Secretary-General's report draws the correct conclusion that Daesh and other terrorist organizations have not ultimately been defeated. They continue their criminal activity in various regions around the world. Now, the center of their force has become Africa. Therefore, it is absolutely essential that we don't allow Africa to become a Caliphate 2.0. There's also the very serious problem of terrorist threats in the northeast of Syria. The illegal US military stationed there have not been able to restore order, or they don't want to. The atmosphere of powerlessness and permissiveness around the area occupied by the American troops has become a fertile breeding ground for all kinds of terrorists. Local fighters have become so strong and so daring that they've been able to openly attack the places where their brothers in arms have been imprisoned. Ultimately, then, even those terrorists who it was earlier possible to put into prison have been liberated. The attempts of the United States to show that they are nonetheless controlling the situation on the ground has at times led to the deaths of many civilians. Therefore, it's difficult to call the recent operation by American Special Forces to eliminate the leader of the terrorists a successful one. One of the most serious humanitarian challenges has also come in the territory illegally occupied by the United States. This is the Al-Hol and the Roj camps. There, tens of thousands of women and children are kept in appalling conditions. The withdrawal of the occupying forces from Syria, the US forces, would allow the Syrians themselves to clear up these terrorist pustules on their territory and guarantee the security of civilians. As practice has shown, the Syrian government would be significantly better placed to deal with these objectives. The Russian Federation supports the efforts of states who are ready to cooperate in the fight against terrorism on the basis of international law. There are more than enough legal instruments to do this, including those developed by the Security Council. The question is always one of will and of genuine intentions. We are paying close attention to the issue of the return of foreign terrorist fighters and members of their families. We think that terrorist attacks must be punished and that we must join the efforts of the global community together to this end. We're convinced that the range of issues connected to foreign terrorist fighters and members of their family can only be resolved in cooperation with the legal authorities of the countries where they are found. Since 2017, Russia has carried out systemic work with the authorities in Iraq and Syria to return children from conflict zones. Across this time, effective cooperation has been set up, allowing us to follow the norms of international law in carrying out work to identify and repatriate children of Russian citizens. To date, we have been able to return around 350 minors from Iraq and Syria. One of the priorities in this area has been guaranteeing the social adaptation of these children. That is carried out, among other things, through providing support to their relatives who have taken them on and are raising them. We also must pay attention to the worrying situation in Afghanistan. There is a local cell of ISIL-Daesh there, Vilayat Khorasan, and according to our assessments, that cell now has more than 6,000 fighters. There is information that there is movement in the northern provinces of Afghanistan of some former government forces coming from the army and the special forces and joining ISIL. This was a similar picture to the one that we saw at the time in Iraq. There is particular concern because a significant number of terrorists in Afghanistan are made up of nationals from the states of Central Asia. This significantly increases the risk of the proliferation of terrorist activity into neighbouring countries. The Secretary-General's report accents the problem of an excess of weapons in the Middle East, in Africa and Afghanistan, which ISIL and other terrorist groups may get hold of. The panicked flight of the United States and its allies from Afghanistan, leaving behind huge volumes of modern weapons and technology, allowed terrorist groups to significantly increase their capacities. The Afghan population has had to pay for the irresponsibility of American and NATO military forces and the many self-appointed experts on the building of democracy, the rule of law, and so-called Western values. They had spent more than 10 years trying to build this artificial construction, but that began to fall apart like a house of cards, even before American troops had been completely withdrawn. It couldn't have been any otherwise. The imposition by force of cookie-cutter democratic values, in a strictly Western sense of them, couldn't have brought any good to those states that were being experimented on. What's also been cheap is the lives of civilians in these geopolitical games. They are written off as collateral damage day by day. It might be worth considering how many people have fallen into this category during the course of so-called highly precise attacks by Americans and their allies in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries. Those countries that have been lucky enough, we might say, to fall under the American steamroller of democratization. Today, our Western colleagues once again made calls for the compliance with human rights and humanitarian law when carrying out counter-terrorist measures. In this connection, we would like to encourage them to begin with themselves, because for the time being, there is a great gap between their words and their deeds. In conclusion, we call for a broad international community to consolidate efforts to counter terrorism in all of its forms and manifestations, without hidden agendas and double standards. Thank you very much for your attention.